The crash of porcelain against the wooden floorboards echoed through Rachel Norwood's small homestead as she crumpled to her knees. Her wedding china, the last remnants of her former life, now nothing more than broken shards scattered around her like the fragments of her shattered dreams. She had managed to hold herself together for 3 months since the funeral, but today, on what would have been her 5th wedding anniversary, the grief crashed over her like a flash flood in the Arizona desert. The year was 1878, and the unforgiving landscape of the Arizona Territory offered little comfort to a widow trying to survive on her own. Rachel's husband Thomas had been taken by typhoid fever after a trip to Tucson, leaving her with their small ranch 10 miles outside the growing settlement of Prescott. At 26, Rachel found herself alone with nothing but memories, debts, and a ranch she could barely maintain. As tears streamed down her face, Rachel didn't hear the approaching hoofbeats over her own sobs. She didn't notice the tall figure dismounting from his horse or the cautious footsteps on her porch. It wasn't until a gentle knock sounded at her door that she looked up, hastily wiping her tears with the back of her hand. "Mrs. Norwood, are you all right in there?" The deep voice carried through the thin wooden door. Rachel scrambled to her feet, embarrassment washing over her as she surveyed the broken dishes. "Just a moment," she called, her voice breaking slightly. She brushed the pieces of china aside with her boot and opened the door just enough to peer out. Wade Yates stood on her porch, his tall frame casting a shadow in the late afternoon sun. His weathered Stetson was in his hands, revealing sandy brown hair that curled slightly at the ends. The local cattle driver was known throughout the territory for his fair dealings and quiet nature. "I was passing by and thought I heard." His blue eyes flickered to her tear-stained face, then to the broken china visible behind her. "I brought some supplies from town. Sheriff mentioned you hadn't been in for a while." Rachel swallowed hard. That's very kind, Mr. Yates, but I don't need charity." Wade shifted his weight, his eyes never leaving hers. "Not offering charity, madam, just being neighborly." He gestured toward his horse where several parcels were tied. "Got some flour, coffee, and salt pork from Willow's General Store." "And Mrs. Willows sent along some of her apple preserves, said they might brighten your spirits." The kindness in his voice nearly undid her again. Rachel had been so determined to prove she could manage on her own that she'd isolated herself, refusing help from the townsfolk who had offered after Thomas's passing. "I can pay you," she insisted. Though they both knew her funds were dwindling, Wade shook his head. "How about we call it an exchange? I've got a herd moving north next week and my cook broke his arm. Could use someone who knows their way around a cooking fire for a few days. Pays fair wages." Rachel hesitated. Working as a trail cook wasn't something a respectable widow typically did, but the offer of honest work instead of handouts appealed to her pride. "I'll think on it," she said finally. Opening the door wider despite the mess behind her, Wade nodded, his eyes catching on the scattered china. "Accident?" Rachel felt her cheeks burn. "Of sorts." Wade stepped inside without invitation, setting his hat on the small table by the door. "My mother always said broken dishes bring good luck." He knelt down and began carefully gathering the larger pieces. "I don't believe in luck anymore, Mr. Yates," Rachel replied softly, but she joined him on the floor, collecting the pieces of her past. "Wade," he corrected. "And sometimes, Mrs. Norwood, luck comes disguised as something else entirely." Rachel looked up to find his eyes on her, not with pity but with something that looked remarkably like understanding. For the first time in months, she felt a flicker of something other than grief. "Rachel," she offered in return, her fingers brushing against his as they reached for the same fragment of porcelain. The spark that jumped between them was unexpected, and Rachel pulled back as if burned. Wade cleared his throat and stood, offering her his hand. "I should bring in those supplies," he said, and Rachel nodded, grateful for the momentary reprieve from the intensity that had suddenly filled her small home. As Wade carried in parcels of food, Rachel found herself studying him. She had seen him in town occasionally before Thomas died, but they had never exchanged more than polite greetings. He moved with an easy grace that belied his size, and there was a gentleness to his actions that contrasted with the hardness of his sun-weathered face. "The cattle drive," Rachel said as he set the last package on her kitchen table. "When does it leave?" "5 days from now," Wade replied. "Heading to the railroad at Flagstaff. Should take about 10 days round trip." Rachel nodded, making calculations in her head. The wages would help her through another month, maybe 2 if she was careful. "I'll do it." Wade's face broke into a smile, transforming his features from handsome to something that made Rachel's heart skip. "You won't regret it. The boys are a decent lot and the work isn't too hard." Rachel found herself returning his smile, the first genuine one to cross her face in months. "I'm not afraid of hard work, Mr. Yates Wade. My father ran cattle in Texas before we moved west. I know my way around a trail drive." "I suspected as much," Wade said, his eyes twinkling. "Not many women would survive out here alone otherwise." The compliment warmed her unexpectedly. As Wade prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "Would it be all right if I stopped by tomorrow? There's a section of your north fence that could use some mending. Noticed it on my way in." "You don't have to do that," Rachel protested. "I know," Wade said simply, "but I'd like to if you'll allow it." Rachel found herself nodding. "Tomorrow, then." After he left, Rachel stood in her doorway watching his figure recede into the distance. The broken dishes still littered her floor, but somehow they didn't seem to represent her shattered life anymore. They were just broken dishes, and perhaps they could be mended or replaced with something new. True to his word, Wade returned the next day with tools and lumber. Rachel watched from her porch as he worked efficiently, repairing not just the section he'd mentioned, but checking the entire perimeter of her property. By midday, she brought out a pitcher of cool water and some corn bread left from breakfast. "You didn't have to do all this," she said as he gratefully accepted the refreshments. Wade wiped his brow with a bandana. "Your husband would have wanted someone looking out for you." The mention of Thomas sent an unexpected pang through Rachel's chest, not the crushing grief she had grown accustomed to, but something softer, more bittersweet. "Yes, he would have. Thomas was a good man," Wade nodded respectfully. "I only met him a few times in town, but everyone spoke highly of him." Rachel settled on the porch step beside him. "How is it you never married, Wade? A man with your skills and reputation could have his pick of women in the territory." Wade chuckled, the sound rich and warm. "Never found the right woman, I suppose, or when I did, the timing wasn't right." His eyes met hers briefly before looking away. "My work keeps me moving. Most women want a man who stays put." "And what about you? What do you want?" The question slipped out before Rachel could stop it. Wade considered this for a long moment. "Land of my own someday, a place to build something lasting." He looked around at her modest ranch. "Something like this, I reckon." The vision he painted was so similar to what she and Thomas had dreamed of that Rachel felt her throat tighten. But instead of bringing pain, the shared dream created an unexpected connection between them. "It's worth fighting for," she said quietly. Wade's eyes held hers. "Yes, it is." The days before the cattle drive passed quickly. Wade stopped by each afternoon, always finding something that needed repair or attention around her property. Rachel found herself looking forward to his visits, preparing extra food or coffee as an excuse to spend time with him. On the day before they were to leave with the herd, Wade arrived with an unexpected gift, a small box containing a simple set of tin dishes. "Not as pretty as your china," he said as she opened it, "but they'll survive the trail better." Rachel ran her fingers over the practical dishes, deeply touched by his thoughtfulness. "Thank you. I wasn't sure what I would bring." "There's something else," Wade said, reaching into his vest pocket. He pulled out a small cloth pouch and handed it to her. Inside, Rachel found several pieces of her broken china, the edges carefully smoothed and holes drilled near the tops. A length of leather cord threaded through them. "My sister taught me how to do this when I was young," Wade explained, somewhat embarrassed. She said beautiful things shouldn't be thrown away just because they're broken. Rachel lifted the makeshift necklace, the porcelain fragments catching the light. The blue floral pattern that had graced her wedding china now transformed into something new and unexpectedly beautiful. Rachel found herself at a loss for words, deeply moved by the gesture. "You don't have to wear it," he said quickly. I just thought. Rachel silenced him by stepping forward and placing her hand on his arm. "It's beautiful. Would you help me put it on?" Wade's fingers brushed the nape of her neck as he fastened the cord, sending a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the cool evening air. When she turned to face him, they stood closer than propriety allowed, but neither moved away. "Thank you," she whispered, her hand unconsciously rising to touch the smooth porcelain pieces. For a moment, Rachel thought Wade might lean down to kiss her, and more surprisingly, she realized she wanted him to. But the moment passed as he stepped back, clearing his throat. "We leave at dawn," he said. "I'll come by to get you." Rachel nodded, both relieved and disappointed. "I'll be ready." The cattle drive began the next morning under clear skies, the herd of 500 cattle stretching out along the trail heading north. Rachel rode in the chuck wagon with an older man named Silas who had agreed to help despite his broken arm. He taught her the rhythms of feeding a hungry crew and the tricks to cooking over an open fire while moving across rough terrain. The work was hard but satisfying. Rachel rose before dawn to start the breakfast fire and worked until well after dusk cleaning up from the evening meal. But the physical labor and purpose helped push away the shadows of grief that had been her constant companions. Wade kept a respectful distance during the day, his duties as trail boss keeping him busy with the herd and the men. But each evening after the camp quieted, he would find his way to the chuck wagon, where they would share coffee and conversation under the vast canopy of stars. On the fourth night, as they sat side by side on a fallen log, Wade asked about her life before Arizona. "My father ran a successful ranch near San Antonio," Rachel explained, watching the flames dance in the campfire. "But after the war, things changed. Cattle prices fell and we struggled. When Father heard about the opportunities in Arizona territory, he decided to sell what was left and start fresh." "And that's how you met your husband?" Wade asked. Rachel nodded. "Thomas was working for the land office in Prescott. He helped us secure our claim." A smile touched her lips at the memory. "He started finding excuses to ride out to our homestead, always with some document that needed signing or question about boundaries. Father saw through it immediately, but he approved of Thomas's character." "He was a lucky man," Wade said softly. Rachel touched the porcelain fragments at her throat. "We had 4 good years together. I try to remember that when the grief feels overwhelming." Wade's hand found hers in the darkness. "Grief is the price we pay for love, but it doesn't diminish what you shared." "You sound like you speak from experience," Rachel observed, not pulling her hand away. Wade was quiet for so long that Rachel thought he might not answer. "Lost my younger brother in '71. Ambushed by a group of raiders near the border. He was just 20. His voice was steady, but Rachel could hear the pain beneath the words. "For a long time I thought the hurt would never ease, but eventually you learn to carry it differently." Rachel squeezed his hand. "Does it ever go away completely?" "No," Wade admitted. "But it makes room for other things, good things, to grow alongside it." They sat in companionable silence, hands linked, until the fire burned low. When Wade finally walked her back to the chuck wagon, his goodnight included a gentle kiss on her forehead that left Rachel's skin tingling long after he had gone. The next morning, as the drive continued north, dark clouds gathered on the horizon. By midday, the sky had turned an ominous green-gray, and Wade rode back to the chuck wagon with concern etched on his face. "Storm's coming," he told Rachel and Silas. "A big one from the look of it. We need to find shelter and hold the herd." Within the hour, rain began to fall in heavy sheets. The cattle grew restless as thunder rumbled overhead, and the men worked frantically to keep the herd together. Rachel helped Silas secure the wagon and supplies as the wind intensified. "There's a box canyon about a mile east," Wade shouted over the howling wind. "Used it before in bad weather. We'll try to move the herd there." Moving 500 frightened cattle through a thunderstorm proved nearly impossible. Despite the cowboys' best efforts, the herd began to scatter when a particularly violent crack of lightning struck a nearby tree. Rachel watched in horror as the cattle surged forward, breaking through the line of riders. Wade's horse reared as he tried to turn back the leaders, and for a heart-stopping moment, Rachel thought he would be trampled. But somehow he maintained his seat and continued working to control the stampede. When the chuck wagon's wheel hit a deep rut, throwing Rachel and Silas to the ground, she found herself in the path of several panicked steers. Without thinking, she rolled under the wagon for protection, pulling the older man with her. "Stay put," Wade's voice carried through the chaos as he appeared beside the wagon, dismounting in one fluid motion. "Are you hurt?" "We're all right," Rachel called back, though Silas was clutching his already injured arm with a grimace. The storm intensified, making it impossible to move the wagon or continue with the drive. Wade made a quick decision. "Leave the wagon. We'll come back for it. You both need to ride with me to the canyon." With remarkable strength, he helped Silas onto his horse, then lifted Rachel up behind the older man. "Hold on tight," he instructed, then began leading the horse on foot through the driving rain. The journey to the canyon seemed endless, the storm's fury making every step treacherous. By the time they reached the relative shelter of the rock walls, Rachel was soaked to the skin and shivering uncontrollably. Most of the cowboys and about 2/3 of the herd had made it to the canyon. The men worked quickly to establish a makeshift camp under an overhanging ledge, building fires to ward off the chill. Silas's arm had been re-injured in the fall, and one of the men with medical experience tended to him while Rachel helped distribute the limited supplies they had managed to bring. "You're freezing," Wade said when he finally returned from ensuring the cattle were secure. He shrugged out of his duster and wrapped it around her shoulders despite being soaked himself. "So are you," Rachel protested, but grateful for the extra layer, Wade led her to one of the small fires. "The storm's not letting up any time soon. We'll need to stay here at least until morning." As night fell, the temperature dropped further. The cowboys huddled around the fires, sharing blankets and stories to keep their spirits up. Rachel found herself pressed between Wade and the canyon wall, his arm around her shoulders providing warmth and comfort. "I'm sorry about all this," he murmured close to her ear. "Not exactly what I promised when I hired you as cook." Despite everything, Rachel laughed softly. "I don't recall no stampedes being part of our agreement." Wade's arm tightened around her. "You were brave out there, quick thinking getting under that wagon." "Years of my father's lectures about what to do during a stampede," Rachel admitted. "Never thought I'd need to use that knowledge." The firelight illuminated Wade's face as he looked down at her, his eyes reflecting both the flames and something warmer. "I'm glad you did. When I saw those steers heading toward you." He didn't finish the sentence, but his hand found hers, fingers intertwining. Rachel leaned into his solid warmth, no longer caring about proprieties. "Thank you for coming back for us." "I would never leave you behind," Wade said, his voice low and intense. Something in his tone made Rachel look up, and what she saw in his eyes took her breath away. Slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, Wade lowered his head until his lips met hers in a gentle kiss. It was brief and chaste, but it sent a flood of emotions through Rachel that she hadn't experienced in a very long time. When Wade pulled back, uncertainty in his expression, Rachel made a decision. She reached up to touch his face, then drew him down for another kiss, this one leaving no doubt about her feelings. Around them, the storm continued to rage, but neither noticed as they found shelter in each other's arms. The storm broke by dawn, leaving behind a washed, clean landscape and considerable work to recover scattered cattle and repair damages. The chuck wagon had survived with minimal damage, though many supplies were ruined by rain. Despite the setbacks, the mood among the cowboys was cheerful as they worked to get back on the trail. Rachel caught several knowing glances directed at her and Wade, but no one commented directly on the change in their relationship. Wade himself seemed both more relaxed and more focused, stopping by the wagon frequently throughout the day with small gestures of affection, a touch on her arm, a private smile, a wildflower picked from the trail and tucked behind her ear. By the time they reached Flagstaff 3 days later, the cattle drive had recovered from the storm's disruption. The herd was delivered to the railroad stockyards, and Wade paid his men, including Rachel, who received the same wages as the other cowboys despite her role as cook. "You earned every penny," Wade insisted when she tried to protest. "Without you, Sila's wouldn't have managed, and we'd have had a mutiny on our hands from hungry cowboys." Their return journey to Prescott was more leisurely, with just the crew and supply wagons making the trip south. Each evening, Wade and Rachel would find time to be alone together, sharing kisses and conversations about their futures. "I've been thinking," Wade said on their last night on the trail as they sat by a small fire away from the main camp. "The Harrington spread just north of your property is for sale, 500 acres with good water rights." Rachel looked at him curiously. "You're thinking of buying it?" Wade nodded, taking her hand. "If I did, I'd be your neighbor." "That would be convenient," Rachel said with a small smile, understanding the direction of his thoughts. "Very convenient," Wade agreed, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "But I'm thinking more long-term than just convenience." Rachel's heart began to beat faster. "How long-term?" Wade shifted to face her fully. "Rachel, I know it's soon. You're still grieving Thomas, and I respect that. But these past 2 weeks have shown me what I want for my future, and that future includes you." Tears welled in Rachel's eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. "Are you proposing to me, Wade Yates?" "Not officially," he clarified with a gentle smile. "That would come later when you're ready, but I am declaring my intentions. I want to court you properly with the hopes that someday you might consider becoming my wife." Rachel touched the pieces of porcelain at her throat, the broken fragments of her past that Wade had transformed into something new and beautiful. It seemed a fitting metaphor for what was happening between them. "I think," she said slowly, "that someday might come sooner than either of us expected." Wade's face lit up with hope. "Does that mean?" "It means," Rachel said, leaning forward to kiss him softly, "that I would be very happy to have you as my neighbor while we explore what's growing between us." 6 months later, on a clear spring morning in 1879, Rachel stood in front of the small church in Prescott, wearing a simple cream-colored dress, the porcelain necklace at her throat complementing the wildflowers in her bouquet. Wade waited for her at the altar, his face radiating joy as she walked toward him. Their courtship had progressed naturally, with Wade purchasing the neighboring property and dividing his time between building his own ranch and helping Rachel improve hers. The townsfolk had watched with approval as the handsome cattle driver and the young widow grew closer, their love story becoming something of a local legend. As they exchanged their vows before friends and neighbors, Rachel felt Thomas's memory as a gentle presence rather than a painful absence. She would always love him, but her heart had expanded to embrace a new love, one born from broken dishes, a timely offer of help, and the healing power of forgiveness. Later, at the small reception held at their newly combined ranch, Wade led Rachel onto a makeshift dance floor set up in the yard. "Happy?" he asked, his arms secure around her waist. Rachel looked up at her new husband, her heart full. "More than I ever thought possible again. We'll have to find a special place to display your wedding china," Wade said with a teasing smile. "What's left of it, anyway?" Rachel laughed, touching the porcelain pieces at her throat. "I think it's exactly where it belongs. Some things are more beautiful after they've been broken and remade." Wade's eyes softened as he understood her meaning. "Like us." "Like us," Rachel agreed, rising on her toes to kiss him as their friends and neighbors applauded around them. As the sun set over their expanding ranch, casting golden light across the land they now shared. Rachel knew that the broken dishes that had once represented her shattered dreams had become the foundation of something far more precious, a love built on compassion, understanding, and the courage to begin again. In the years that followed, their ranch prospered, eventually becoming one of the most successful operations in the territory. They added to their family with the birth of 2 children, a boy and a girl, who grew up strong and capable under the loving guidance of their parents. And whenever life presented challenges, as it inevitably did, Rachel would touch the smooth porcelain pieces that she continued to wear around her neck, and remember that sometimes the most beautiful things come from what appears, at first, to be irreparably broken.